fire and smoke on the water was all that was left for the Japanese in our last episode, as their hopes for regaining the initiative in New Guinea sank into the depths of the Bismarck Sea. On the other side, the Allies rejoiced over their great victory. The enemy convoy to reinforce Leh and launch a renewed offensive against Wau destroyed in an expertly coordinated airstrike. Yet that would not be the only major naval victory that the Allies enjoyed during this week. Today we turn back to the Solomon Islands to cover some new developments, as the Americans prepare to embark on a naval bombardment of the key Japanese bases at Munda and Villa Stanmore, and will also return to China to see the start of yet another Japanese offensive north of the Yangtze River. Hey history fans, as you know, the YouTube algorithm precludes us from releasing more than 3 or 4 videos per week, as the more we release, the lower the average views are, which hurts the overall standing of the channel in search rankings and such. Still, we produce more videos than that, and we want to give our viewers a chance to watch them. Videos are now published as YouTube member and Patreon exclusives. For just $5 per month, yes, 1 cup of coffee, you'll get access to 25 new videos. Currently we're running 2 battle series, the Peloponnesian Wars and the Italian Unification Wars. Click the link in the description or pinned comment, and you'll get exclusive videos, early access to all videos, learn our schedule, get access to our private Discord, watch our behind-the-scenes videos, and much more. Thank you for watching and your kind support. We wouldn't be able to do what we love without you. This week first takes us to China, one of the bloodiest and most forgotten theatres of the Pacific War. As we'll recall, the Japanese had formed the 11th Army, now under the command of Lieutenant General Yokoyama Isamu, to occupy all of the important regions in the Wuchang-Hankou sector. Yet the Chinese still occupied the Triangle Zone on the northern side of the Yangtze River, with Mianyang as its central point. Taking advantage of this vital strategic position, the defenders had been conducting guerrilla warfare and sabotage operations against Yokoyama's main base. Therefore, the Japanese planned to extend their occupational zone to strengthen their position and finally destroy the enemy in the area. But it wasn't any ordinary Chinese force they were about to face. This brigade unit was from the Communist New Fourth Army, a reorganized irregular army that fought independently all across central China, isolated from and unfriendly to the Nationalist Army. In fact, these two forces often clashed with each other as often as they clashed with their Japanese enemies. Yet despite this, the 5th Division of Commander Li Shanyan had successfully beaten the puppet forces of Wang Jingwei's regime during the 1942 Battle of the Dorf Mountain, completely destroying one enemy division and capturing Mianyang in the process. The 11th Army then subsequently carried out attacks directed from the north to drive away the communist forces, but to no avail, as the entrenched Chinese soldiers had established solid fortifications amongst the very difficult terrain. Thus, Yokoyama planned to launch a surprise attack on the enemy's rear from Yueyang and Jingzhou, with the objective of luring away the enemy's attention, while the 58th Division launched the main attack against Mianyang. In early February, as the 40th and 13th Divisions began to concentrate at Yueyang and Jingzhou respectively, the Japanese also attempted to deceive the enemy into believing that a possible offensive operation against Changsha was on the horizon. On February 15th, the operation north of the Yangtze finally started, as the 40th surreptitiously crossed the river and moved towards the enemy bases in the Chuhoshi area, with some minor elements also moving to secure the Qianli area. While the bulk of the 13th Division likewise advanced east to crush the communist bases in the Yangqiechang area. The Chinese were taken completely by surprise by this sudden attack, suffering many losses before they could withdraw towards Mianyang, where Brigadier Wang Haishan immediately started to prepare for an attack from the south. Yet no attack came for a week, as Yokoyama was preparing the 58th Division for its impending advance. Then, on February 21st, the final phase of the operation was at last set in motion, as the 58th Division began to march south on Mianyang, while the 40th and 13th Divisions closed in on Fengkao and Fuchang respectively. The Communist forces offered strong resistance during the coming days, inflicting almost 1,000 casualties on the Japanese forces, but they would be no match against the full might of 3 Japanese divisions that also enjoyed effective air support by the 44th Air Regiment. With their bases destroyed, the Chinese would disperse and attempt to escape. Many of them would successfully avoid capture by passing through the enemy lines, disguised as native civilians. Yet Yokoyama would launch an intensive search and pursuit action that lasted until late March and saw many of the communist soldiers getting captured, including their leader Wang Haishan. As a result of this operation, the Triangle region was successfully occupied, and the main Chinese line was repelled all the way to the Yangtze, thus leaving the Japanese in a more favorable position in regards to future operations. Moving on to the South Pacific, the effects of the disastrous Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the defeats suffered at Bunagona and Guadalcanal still reverberated in the Japanese imperial headquarters. As they entered into a new and unsatisfactory phase, the Japanese were determined to reinforce and strengthen the Munda-Rabaul-Ley line, to step up air bombing of recently won Allied positions, to dig up a road from Madang to Finschhafen in order to be partially independent of the sea, and to wait for the enemy to take the initiative. During this period, it would be their submarines and coast-hugging barges that would see the most action, as they braved the Allied air and sea blockade in the South Pacific almost nightly. In General MacArthur's command, the Allies celebrated the destruction of the enemy convoy on March 3rd, yet they could not capitalize on this success to launch an all-out offensive against Ley. One of the reasons for this was MacArthur's lack of an amphibious force to support the army in New Guinea. Although Rear Admiral Daniel Barbie began the build-up of such a force in January 1943, it would take considerable time until this force could be ready. On March 15th, by a stroke of Admiral King's pen, the Southwest Pacific Force also became the 7th Fleet, under the command of Admiral Arthur Carbender, though this fleet would remain very small, to the disgust of MacArthur. Meanwhile, PT boats would maintain their unique position as sole surface representatives of the US in the Solomon Sea for another 6 months, constantly looking for action but seldom finding it. Carbender similarly encouraged their use in his command, as can be shown through their effective use in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Back in Rabaul, Admiral Kosaka had been named commander of the Southeast Area Fleet by the end of 1942, which made him responsible for the 8th Fleet and for all naval forces in the Bismarcks, Solomons and New Guinea. Knowing that he could expect little or no help from the combined fleet or the army, Kosaka set about strengthening the air defences of Rabaul, speeded up the airfield development at Munda and Villa Stanmore, and started to survey Santa Isabel Island for an additional strip. With the 200 fighters and bombers under his command, he hoped to hold the Central Solomons with air power alone. Against him, Admiral Fitch now counted with some 316 planes of all types on Guadalcanal, and the Cactus Air Force could easily be reinforced from a pool of over 200 more at Espiritu Santo and New Caledonia. The Americans were also bringing new types of aircraft, better and more efficient, while their older models were updated to have higher power, higher arms and armor, and a longer range. In contrast, the Japanese continued to employ the same types of aircraft. Their weaknesses were well known by this point in the war, and the Americans had developed their new models to counter them. The only advantage still enjoyed by the Japanese at this point was that they owned a nicely spaced series of airstrips in the South Pacific, with the Munda base being particularly important, as bombers from Rabaul or Bougainville could stop there only long enough to refuel on their striking missions. Against this tactic, the Americans launched a number of air and naval bombardments, which pitted Munda Field with holes, but to no avail, as the Japanese filled in the craters with crushed coral, and in a matter of minutes or hours, the strip was again operational. Nonetheless, Admiral Halsey had decided to carry out a new naval bombardment of the enemy air bases at Munda and Villa Stanmore for the start of March, and the Japanese had become even more confident of the invulnerability of these two outposts, with cargo and troop ships from Rabaul making the run to Munda and Villa Stanmore more openly than ever. To achieve a simultaneous bombardment, and to combat any enemy supply convoy and escorts, Halsey knew that he would need to send a larger force with considerable firepower. Thus, on February 27th, he decided to appoint Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill's Task Force 68 for the operation, which counted with a total of 3 light cruisers and 7 destroyers, divided into 2 groups, one for Munda and the other for Villa Stanmore. Departing Espiritu Santo in the afternoon of March 4th, Merrill first headed to the new base at the Russell Islands, arriving there that night after passing east and north of San Cristobal. Although he intended to employ the same tactics that had been used successfully during the last 2 bombardments carried out back in January, he also decided to illuminate Blackett Strait with star shells before reaching the firing line, and to employ only destroyers for the bombardment of Munda, because of the reported presence of enemy shipping in the target areas. In the afternoon of March 5th, Merrill's forces finally left the Russells en route to their departure point 7 miles north of Dyson Island. After arriving there at night, the 4 destroyers of the Munda detachment would leave the formation without signal and head to their objective. Meanwhile, Merrill's forces would continue on course towards the Kula Gulf, with the Americans believing that they had not been detected up to this point. That same night, however, the Japanese destroyers Murasame and Minegumo had taken supplies to Villa Stanmore, with Captain Tachibana Masao deciding to safely travel on a route through the Vella Gulf and Blackett Strait. Unbeknownst to them, their departure had been discovered by American reconnaissance, which rapidly relayed this information to Admiral Merrill. For the Americans, a battle was on the horizon. Nonetheless, estimations about their speed and course made it impossible for them to intercept the enemy destroyers, so Merrill would decide to carry out his original plan with 2 slight alterations: to increase speed so that they could start the bombardment before the Munda detachment, which would alert the Japanese vessels should they be in the strait, and to fire at any hostile units revealed during the illumination of Blackett Strait. Yet upon delivering the supplies, Captain Tachibana unfortunately decided to return to the Shortlands via the shorter route through the Kula Gulf, a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Shortly after midnight, in accordance with Merrill's operational plan, the 3 light cruisers were directed to swing into Kula Gulf, while the destroyer Waller was detached from the formation for an advanced sweep of the Gulf over the intended track. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyers were sailing in the opposite direction along the east coast of Kolombangara, when at 0053 the radar of the cruiser Montpellier detected the 2 enemy vessels to the northeast of Sasamboki Island. Soon all the other ships had made contact, so they began tracking the enemy and training their guns. Then, at 0101, the Montpellier broke the silence as it opened with her main battery, followed almost immediately by the Cleveland and the Denver. Concentrating their fire on the Murasame, the Americans made effective use of the radar-controlled gunnery and successfully straddled the destroyer. At about 0106, one of the salvos that hit her caused a big explosion and subsequently started large fires on her deck. Meanwhile, the Waller had fired a spread of 5 torpedoes just as the cruisers had opened fire, scoring 1 critical hit on the Murasame, which suffered a tremendous explosion, immediately broke in 2 and sank. Merrill then directed to open fire on the Minegumo, as the destroyer continued on a northerly course while attempting to return fire. Yet the efforts of the Japanese would be fruitless, and the Minegumo would finally come to a stop after about 4 miles because of the damage inflicted by the concentrated fire of the American cruisers. At about 0130, the Waller was ordered to close in and finish her off, but the Minegumo finally sank before the American destroyer could get in position. In the meantime, Merrill's cruisers had gotten into the firing line by 0123, so the Montpellier was ordered to fire more than 30 star shells over Blackett Strait. The very effective illumination proved that the strait was now empty, so the bombardment of Villa Stanmore immediately began at 0125, targeting supply dumps, runways, bivouacs and dispersed aircraft, and launching continuous fire under the direction of reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead. The Americans managed to score many hits on emplacements thought to be shelter tents, on barracks, ammunition dumps, grounded planes and other objectives, successfully causing highly devastating damage, starting large fires, and knocking out shore batteries that attempted to respond. After completing their task at 0140, Merrill's forces then started to withdraw through the New Georgia Sound. At the same time, the Munda Detachment, commanded by Captain Robert Briscoe, proceeded unmolested to their landfall off Banyeta Point, where they were to turn to the firing line at 0104. As the turn was executed, the destroyers heard and saw the firing marking the surface battle of Blackett Strait, and the appearance of an unidentified aircraft coming from Rendova Island further disrupted their orderly approach to the firing line. By 0139, however, Briscoe had finally assembled at the firing line, and 2 minutes later, the destroyer Fletcher opened fire, with the other destroyers quickly following. The Fletcher's first ranging salvos managed to strike the center of the landing strip, and then the destroyer moved her fire down to Munda Point, blasting the installations beyond the point along the shore. At 0150, the bombardment ceased, and Briscoe's detachment began their withdrawal. Finally, around 0715, the two detachments rejoined north of Savo Island, and, under the protection of fighter coverage from Guadalcanal, proceeded back to Purvis Bay. The two bombardments had been well executed and were considered a success, but once again they had no long-lasting effect, as the Japanese bases would be rapidly repaired and made operational again during the coming weeks. The most important and encouraging result of the operation was the efficient and speedy destruction of the two enemy destroyers, which would serve as a bad omen for the Japanese in the future. In the following weeks, Allied air forces would continue to strike at Japanese concentrations throughout the South Pacific, but particularly against the ground installations in the Northern Solomons, with more than 90 attacks carried out against Munda by mid-March, while Villa Stanmore was being raided almost daily. Nonetheless, the Japanese would continue to pour reinforcements into these bases at night, further adding motor torpedo boats to the defences of Kula Gulf. The Americans, meanwhile, would carry out another naval bombardment of Villa Stanmore on March 16th, although the results of this operation would be far less spectacular. Yet these operations were only the beginning, as Admirals Halsey and Nimitz would continue to plan on how to break the Bismarck's barrier. Next week, however, we'll return to Burma to continue with our coverage of the Arakan campaign and the Chindits expedition, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.